All right, we are live. Welcome back to another InSession Film Live episode. I'm, of course, JD Duran. Joining me, as always, for these lovely episodes is the great Richard Newby from The Hollywood Reporter. Richard, welcome back, my friend.
Hey, thanks for having me, man.
Yeah, so obviously this time around, we're talking The Falcon and the Winter Soldier, even though earlier on Twitter I misspoke and put Captain America and the Winter Soldier. But in hindsight, I kind of wish I just would have left it that way because, as we all seen in the series, that's kind of accurate. I wasn't wrong, really.
You weren't wrong.
However you want to name it, Falcon and the Winter Soldier, Captain America and the Winter Soldier. We're going to talk about it. Obviously, as of today, it wraps up its 6-episode run. Usually at this point, Richard, I toss it to you, get your overall thoughts on it. Then we come back to me and we kind of go back and forth. I think for this episode, we're going to do a little bit of role reversal here.
All right.
And I'm going to kind of go first because there's one thing I need to get off my chest because there's a lot of good things to talk about. But for listeners of our show and people that know how I feel about, the MCU, they'll probably know that this is coming because I need to talk about some Baron Zemo. We need to first talk about this. Let me first say I did like the series overall. I thought it was very good. We'll get into a lot of the great stuff here in a little bit. I did have one major problem. There's a few little filmmaking things here and there. But one major problem I have is the inclusion of Zemo in this show. Because for one, what does he even do? What does he do in the show, Richard? He shows up, they break him out of prison, he flies him to a couple different places, and then that's it. They use him for his plane. That's it. Which is, and it's kind of weird because like in Civil War, he's built up to be like this emotional, gritty, ex-military dude who's driven by grief. That's how he's built up. But in this movie he's more, I don't know what the word is. He's all rich and he's wealthy and I got my plane and I got my butler dude over here. And it's like, that's not the same guy. So I didn't really care for how he was depicted or how he was used. But for further context, I do want to set the table for this as well, because Captain America Civil War, and I know most of you will disagree, some vehemently disagree, that's fine. Civil War for me is the best MCU movie. I love it. Absolutely love it. And I think what's great about it is that Zemo in that movie, I don't think he's not a villain. He's barely an antagonist of that movie. What's really driving that movie's drama is guilt and grief. All Zemo is doing is kind of poking those emotions in the Avengers. And then once those emotions get riled up, that's when the Avengers kind of turn on themselves, right? Yeah. But you look at it from his perspective, and I've always argued this, Richard, that if that movie was from his perspective, if we watched that whole series of events from Zemo's perspective, he's a Jason Bourne-like figure that we empathize with, right? His family was killed. Yeah. The Avengers, they're doing all these things. They don't think about the ramifications, and understandably, they're trying to get Ultron and trying to save the world, but there's so many things that they overlook. And there are severe consequences to it all. And there's no ramifications, right? Like Age of Ultron doesn't deal with the aftermath.
Yeah.
All it deals with there's a lot of things about that movie I like, but it doesn't deal with the human cost of it all.
Right.
So you understand from Zemo's perspective, like these guys kill my family and they're not taking responsibility for it. Of course you'd be upset. I would be upset as well. The only difference between me and Zemo is he's this ex-military dude who has the means to do something about it. But he's also aware that he's not like a super villain. He has no superpowers. So he can't take on the Avengers. So you get them to implode from within. And he goes about doing that by manipulating their emotions, manipulating guilt and grief, which I love about that movie. But I think there's so much to empathize with that, with him as a character, very similar to Killmonger and Black Panther. Really the biggest thing with Zemo was maybe some of the means, right? Like some of the things, maybe morally he crosses boundaries at times, but we understand, we empathize with where he's coming from. That Zemo, I feel like, is gone in this series. And Falcon and Winter Soldier, some of that is there. Obviously, there's references to his family still being gone. His country being gone, like some of that is there. And I love that in Daniel Bruhl's performance. I think he brings that. But mostly like that Zemo from that film, from Civil War, is not in this show. That irked me. And then also narratively, the big thing is like, what's his purpose here? Like, because all he does is fly them from one place to another. And how many times in these movies, like, we never see how they travel. It's like we never see them go to an airport, get on a plane, and go. Like, they just, they're in one part of the world in one scene. We cut to the next scene, and they're in another part of the world. Like, that's how these movies operate. Like, we don't need an airplane. So maybe you can, draw some insight into that. Maybe you have a different opinion. I'll be curious to hear. But that's really my biggest nitpick. I feel like he's completely wasted. He's no purpose to him in this show at all, other than maybe to set up other things coming down the road. But I don't know if you needed to do that in this show, because there were so many other great things to explore that I love, that I certainly want to get into. But I wanted to get that off my chest, because that's really my only major criticism, because I love Zemo. He's my dude. One of my favorite villains, quote unquote villains, antagonists of the MCU. Yeah. Other than that, I have nothing but positives to talk about for the rest of this episode.
Yeah, I totally respect what you're saying, and I get where you're coming from. For me, I saw his role in Falcon and the Winter Soldier as being his. It's a continuation of his concerns about superpowered beings.
Yeah, that was at least consistent. Yeah,
I do think that the issues that he raises about superheroes being a form of supremacy is really interesting. I think that also gave Sam a lot to think about in terms of his own role of becoming Captain America. So for me, it was kind of, he was a bit of a devil's advocate in some ways, and I think that he was probably more important to Sam's journey than perhaps maybe his own agency. Okay. It is interesting, I think, because he does actually succeed in doing what he wants to do. Like, he wipes out super soldiers again for the second time. He has
basically succeeds in Civil War too, right? Like, he basically gets what he wants in the end.
Yeah, so he's 2-for-0. He wins.
Exactly. That's all he does.
Yeah,
I think win-win-win.
I think that the dynamic between him and Sam and Bucky is really what grabbed me. I do think that there's definitely some differences between what we saw in Civil War, but I kind of just chalked it up to, he's been in prison for 5 years. 5 years in solitude, and when we left him in Civil War, he very much wanted to die, and so I think it's kind of interesting that when we pick up with him here, he seems at least more full of life, or more committed to some new ideal. It's almost as if like he has some new purpose. I'm not entirely sure we know what that purpose fully is yet.
That was going to be my next question. Like, is that contrived, or just we haven't gotten there yet? Because it does, like, there's a jarring shift there, and I don't know what's motivating.
Part of me just thinks it's just kind of the nature of the serialized storytelling of the MCU, which it doesn't excuse certain gaps in logic, but I do feel like sometimes we come back to these series or movies and they're somehow better in retrospective, which is also the same kind of issue and principle that guides the comic books, right? Where
Yeah,
seeing
sure.
these characters and then eventually something's retconned and it ends up being
Yeah.
better and making more sense later on. So I
Yep.
just kind of took it in stride and just kind of enjoyed the moments that he had with Sam
Yeah.
and Bucky. Yeah.
I do think you make a good point. While narratively, in terms of plotting, I still feel like it's pretty useless, like as a conclusion. But you do make a good point, and maybe I overlooked this a little too much because a big part of Bucky's arc here is that he's doing like the 12-step process, right?
Yeah.
Or at least part of it where, part of that, whether it be Alcoholics Anonymous or really any addiction, if you do that 12-step process, a big part of it is facing people you've wronged and apologizing for it. And there's really several scenes where that comes into play for Bucky. I really love the moment he has where Sam, where it's, he takes it a step further. It's not just apologizing. Like, you have to serve these people. Like, that was a really great moment.
Yeah.
But the idea itself is really great. Obviously, that was why episode 1 is maybe my favorite episode of the entire run, because it was all about the emotion of Sam and Bucky. Sam dealing with his sister and the family boat, and there was the whole bang scene, which was really intriguing. And Bucky, still dealing with the aftermath of being the Winter Soldier, talking with the psychologist, the emotion of it all, facing the old man in the apartment was so poignant and heartbreaking. But part of that process is also Zemo, right? Because Zemo wronged him in some big ways. He's in the book. And so watching them confront each other, and I guess I did really like that. I mean, because I saw some YouTube, videos or some written reviews and stuff. And I know some people have kind of criticized Bucky's facing of Zemo, thinking that it was a little light. To me, it makes sense for someone in his position who's trying to go through forgiveness and redemption. It makes sense that he wouldn't just confront Zemo and just straight up kill him.
Right.
Like, I love that he kind of handles it gracefully.
Yeah.
Like, to me, that made sense. And I do think their back and forth was great. Then, of course, you get the great moment there at the memorial in the 5th episode, I believe that was. So, the inclusion of Zemo, I do, from that angle of it, I do think is great.
Yeah.
A lot of the rest of it is still I'm kind of mixed on, but the Bucky stuff, I think you make a great point with.
I'll add that I also think, in terms of how we look at Carly Morgenthau on the show, I think that Zemo is a really important addition because I think that he's kind of what connects, this kind of, I think, gap between Steve Rogers and the Red Skull, right? Like, these are two extremes. And so I think that helps Sam and Bucky both kind of process who Carly is, right? Because she's clearly not a straightforward villain. I mean, her reasons are very sound. Her methods are not, which I'm sure we'll get into a little bit later. But I do think that the concerns that he raises about people with power and how governments are formed around them, or how they're backed by armies, I think that really hits home. So in some ways, he's kind of this like not a Jiminy Cricket figure per se, but he does I think provide some conscience in terms of what's going on. I think that he makes the whole morality a little more complicated, especially if we're talking about looking at Steve Rogers' concept of morality, and it's founded in World War II, right? You have Nazis and Hydra who are clearly evil, and Steve Rogers and the Allies who are very much good. I think that Zemo's position, it clouds that morality. It's saying that well, Carly is not a Red Skull type figure yet, but what does she become? What does she become when her desires start treading over the desires of others in violent ways? So I think that there's a lot of interesting points that he makes.
Yeah, I agree. I do think that those conversations on the airplane are interesting and a microcosm. I think part of my issue with that, though, is that the show seems to misunderstand where Zemo came from. Because everything that the show talks about in relation to Carly is exactly, almost verbatim, the parallels are uncanny to Zemo in Civil War. Like what Carly is fighting for in terms of being motivated by emotion, being wronged by these bigger corporations, whether it be big governments in this case or the Avengers in Civil War, they're the same character. Yet Sam and Bucky and the show overall, they treat Zemo as if that never happened. They treat Zemo as if he's more of a conventional antagonist. He's the next big thing that they're going to have to fight. It's like and that was part of the issue that I had as the show kind of delved into that more. There were moments where Sam and Bucky, I mean, they blatantly, when they were talking about Zemo, they were talking about him as of like, oh my gosh, like he did all these things. Don't you remember when he did this? And it's like, without ever addressing what was motivating Zemo to begin with. The fact that, yes, he did blow up a building. And yes, maybe he did manipulate the Winter Soldier, but do you remember why? Do you remember that it was you that caused that? I don't know, Sam. Bucky, do you guys remember that? You guys remember you guys had a big part of that. But the show never like it you know what I mean? Like it completely forgets all of that stuff and treats Zemo more conventionally. But really he was more Carly than anything else. Carly is just another interpretation of who Zemo was, and the show forgets that. And maybe maybe I'm just biased, maybe it's just personal to me because I loved that depiction of Zemo in Civil War. But it is crazy. Like you look at what Carly does in this show and it's the same all the way down to blowing up the building.
Yeah.
Right. Like the only difference is the ending, which maybe we can get into in a little bit. Characters end up in different places.
Yeah.
But so the parallels again on paper are interesting. I just wish that the show would have addressed that a little bit more with Zemo and recognizing what motivated him to begin with. And I just feel like that's gone all the way down to this fluffy coat that he has on and all this wealth and riches. Like, I don't know. They're two different characters and I don't know why.
I will say, I think the show acknowledges Zemo's past, and he talks specifically. He asked Sam and Bucky if they visited Sokovia, the memorial.
Yeah, great. That's a great moment. I love that.
I don't think I think it's true that Sam and Bucky perhaps don't acknowledge his reasons, and I think that Zemo makes a fair point. You guys want to play superheroes, but then you don't really care about the aftermath of what happens to these people. And so I do think that the show is aware.
Yeah. And that does provoke Sam. Yeah. That ultimately that does move him. So maybe I'm being too harsh on it because in the moment it just felt like they were overlooking a lot of where Zemo came from, like fundamentally, like in terms of that groundedness we see him, that gritty Zemo we get, I feel like is overlooked here. But maybe I just need to go back and rewatch it now that we have the whole thing, right? I can go back and see how it goes. Because you are right. There is that moment between him and Sam. And then ultimately Sam comes around, not to say that he's on Zemo's side or agrees with him, but ultimately the way he looks at Carly is ironically, a lot of where Zemo found himself at the end of Civil War. So he does kind of, in a weird way, provoke him.
His final speech, I think, at the end too, when he, talks about the use of the term terrorists.
Great point.
The senators, well, what do they call you? You are displacing people, making people feel, alienated and without resource. So I do think that Zemo gets into his head in some good ways, which I think is an interesting, kind of twist from the comics, and kind of looking at a more conventional villain. Where Zemo getting into their heads is ultimately right a terrible evil thing, and in the comics he's a Nazi. But here I do think that there is some consideration for him as a character, as being someone different and kind of in a moral gray area.
Yeah, and I do love that gray area for sure. That was, again, big reason why I loved him in Civil War, and we do get that in glimpses here. And maybe again, I just need to go back and rewatch the entire thing, because when it was like episode 3, I think it was episode 3, like when Sam and Bucky are talking about him, completely overlooking that they were the reason that he went off and did these things. Like they completely, that went way over their head. And so in that moment, I'm like, I'm on Team Zemo right now, not on your guys' side at all. As much as I love their interaction and stuff. So I guess I just need to go back and relook at some of that stuff. But I am looking at, like, obviously we're going to get more Zemo later on. So hopefully they'll kind of rework some of this stuff, the more we see him. I do want to talk, kind of pivot here a little bit, because obviously there's so many great things to talk about. Let's first talk about Isaiah Bradley, the MVP of this show.
Yeah.
My God, what an incredible character. Incredible character. Every time he was on screen, I had chills.
Oh, yeah, he owned
so
it.
Good. So good.
Carl Lumbly, he showed up.
Oh, my gosh. Incredible.
He did. Every line, he showed up. He was
my
there.
Goodness. Yeah, brought his A game. Oh, my gosh, I love it. I know between him and Catherine Hahn, like the supporting characters in these shows they've come to play for sure.
Yeah.
Well, let's get your thoughts on that. Obviously you've written about this a lot in your post at the Hollywood Reporter, which is great. I urge everyone to please go read it. But just to kind of hear it from you a little bit more. I mean, I loved how they included him, the arc of that whole through line with Sam throughout the show. I thought was nothing short of brilliant.
Yeah, I love that. Whenever Isaiah Bradley's on screen, he hits hard, right? It's not giving Sam like easy lobs to kind of come up with answers with. And there's not a single thing that he says in the entire series that is incorrect. Everything he says is true. And I think that is the most difficult thing for Sam to kind of deal with. And I think that Sam is very much aware, on some level of, the kind of systemic racial issues that, made him have to give up the shield and then replace him with John Walker. Like, I think that, Sam is aware of those things, but I also think that because he is a superhero, because he's fought alongside the Avengers, because he's been Steve Rogers' partner, that he wants to believe that things are different. And it goes back to something that Isaiah says in the 5th episode, where he says that nothing is different. And I think that it's really interesting. And I touched on this in my piece a little bit today, but I think that it's important that Sam look at the realities of our world, of the present and the past, right? And deal with the buried secrets of American history that we don't want to acknowledge. But I also think that it is important that he maintains that optimism, that he does believe that things are different, because ultimately what makes him an inspiring figure is that, he can see beyond certain limits that have been imposed upon people in this country. I think that Sam kind of wants America to be better than what it is.
Yeah.
And I think that that's a very noble thing. And I talked today about kind of the reality of the world versus, kind of what we want it to be, and whether it's realistic at all for a Black man to be able to take up the mantle of Captain America, to be able to actually, walk around carrying that identity without, ending up exactly the same as Isaiah Bradley did. And I'm not sure that it's entirely realistic, but, I think that for these superheroes to matter, to inspire, we have to kind of stretch the bounds of reality, right? And look beyond of, what do we hope to achieve here? And so I think that that's kind of important in terms of where Sam ends up at the end and what he takes from Isaiah.
Yeah, I absolutely love, excuse me, I love their dynamic, love that dichotomy of the cynicism of the past that we see in Isaiah, and very understandably so, given what he had experienced, versus hope for the future that is embodied in Sam throughout the entire show. And even though there's empathy to be had, Sam certainly understands and empathizes with Isaiah for sure.
Oh, yeah.
But I love how he listens to him. Like that whole moment, and I think it was the 5th episode, right, where Isaiah talks about his past, and we get into the details a little bit, which is so devastating, heartbreaking. And yet, by the end of that episode, while Sam fully empathizes, fully understands, listens to him, yet at the end, completely reverses course from where Isaiah would have gone with that whole notion of him being Captain America. But I love how he does it respectfully. Like, it's not like, this guy doesn't know what he's talking about.
Right.
Like, he empathizes and understands and realizes that all that pain, all that sacrifice doesn't need to be thrown away, that we can still want a better future. We can still hope for it and build toward it. And that's why me becoming Captain America is important, because we are taking steps toward that. I love the progression of that. Absolutely love it, especially the emotion built into it. And it all just kind of comes together beautifully. It's incredible.
Yeah, I think it's really important that Isaiah isn't made to look like the old fool, or like the guy who's wrong, right? He's not out of line in any way.
No,
and I appreciate
like you said, nothing he says is incorrect.
Yeah, I appreciate that Sam respects that, but at the same time, he realizes that he has to be his own man. And so I think that it's very similar to the conversation he has with Bucky, right? Bucky's entire life, he's been defined by what other people have told him he is. Like, ever since he's been in his early 20s, right? You're a soldier, you're an agent of Hydra, you're the White Wolf, you're Captain America's redeemed ally. You're always in relation to somebody else. And I think that is very much true for Sam as well. And I think that part of his journey to becoming Captain America is realizing that doing it for Steve, and he's not doing it, or he's not doing it because of Isaiah, right? He's choosing his own path.
Exactly.
And he's taking the past of these two men who had very different experiences with the super soldier serum, very different experiences with the U.S. government, acknowledging that and then moving forward.
Yeah, absolutely. And like I said, I love the writing of that. Love how Sam, kind of, he channels what he's learned from Steve over the years, listening to this man that he fully understands, and then kind of takes all of that, builds it into one concoction, and chooses something that he thinks will be better, not just for himself, obviously, but for the country, for the world, for the symbol of carrying that shield and what it means. It's just all handled great. And of course, it affects Bucky as well. I think it's really interesting. You're talking about identity there with Bucky, and how he's always kind of been defined under, whatever umbrella you want to put him under. That is such a big part of him in this show as well, especially as it relates to Steve, right? Because he's always kind of put himself in relation to Steve. There's that great moment. One of the best moments of this show, I think, is, and we see the comedic elements of it in the trailer when they're both in, talking to the psychiatrist or whatever, and they're facing off against one another, and there is some levity there in the moment. But the moment that stands out to me the most is when Bucky, cathartically tells him, like, if he was wrong about you, then he's wrong about me.
Yeah.
Like, that is so telling of where Bucky is mentally as far as how he looks at himself.
Right.
And then later on in episode 5, Sam and Bucky have that great conversation where he's like, look, I love Steve, but you need to kind of let him go. Like, you need to kind of step outside of that and be your own person, because you are your own person. You have your own personality, your own strengths and weaknesses. And I love that honesty. And it's those little moments, and it's so great too, right? Because the chemistry between Mackie and Sebastian Stan is it's unmatched. I mean, it's really great. And while there can be like these little jabs at each other, like these little playful jabs they have with each other, they can also they know when to restrain that, to let the emotion, let the honest truth come out between them as well. And that was one of those where around the playfulness and before the moment, after the moment, they're still being playful, but they let that moment still breathe, where Bucky kind of realizes that his identity doesn't have to be tethered to all of these different roles, like you were just talking about.
And I think that makes both Sam and Bucky an interesting foil to John Walker, who is very much in the same boat, where he is what other people tell him he is, and yet he is entirely fine with that, right? He's entirely fine with being a lapdog, right? He's fine with being this soldier who is named Captain America by the government and then later named U.S. agent by Val, where he has no ambition of his own in terms of an identity outside of being a U.S. soldier, right? That's essentially all he is. That's all he can conceive of himself to be. And I think that's really interesting in terms of the contrast between the two Captain Americas, so to speak.
Yeah, and I completely agree. It is interesting how John Walker does. He's always been defined by this one thing of being the soldier.
Yeah.
And that is interrupted. Like, when that's stripped away from him, like, what does that do to him? Yet in the end, that's also the thing that kind of reins him back in many ways as well.
Right.
So it's almost like he knows his role almost to, like, it's in a way that's almost too restrictive. And like, it kind of pushes him over the cliff for a moment, at least for a little bit, until he's reminded of why he was doing this in the first place. But given some of the emotional, confliction in the middle of that, what happens to his friend, you can understand why someone would be pushed over the edge.
Yeah.
And that to me, I think, is what's really great about his evolution over the course of the 6 episodes. And Wyatt Russell is just fantastic in tapping into that. So, like you said, I'm very curious to see where that character goes, especially because we don't know anything about Val. And I guess spoiler alert for those that haven't seen this show, because we do need to reference this. Because Julia Louis-Dreyfus, I had no clue she was going to be in this. What a tease. I had no idea. She's incredible. She's so good. Yeah. And I love that she's a complete mystery. Like, she has 2 scenes. They're both great, but we don't know anything about her.
Yeah.
And I think laying the table with that and how John Walker's involved in all of that, I'm very curious to see where that goes.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because there's been, some conversation about John Walker's, sort of redemption at the end, and how we're supposed to kind of see him in those final moments where he gets the new black suit. And I think it's interesting, kind of, what you said about, once he loses that title of Captain America, he kind of, goes off the edge. But I feel like John Walker is always teetering on the edge, and I feel like U.S. Agent reins him back in, but I don't think that we're meant to feel like comfortable, like, okay, yeah, like this is a steady guy. Like he's like, I'm back, and he's very excited about being this government operative for reasons that he clearly does not understand, but it doesn't matter. He's basically just a weapon and saying, point me this way.
The suit.
Yeah. And so I think that is really interesting. And I think that, maybe it got looked over a little bit in terms of, the questions of, is John Walker a hero now? And it's like, well, yes, there have always been heroic aspects to his character, right? He's not out to be a super villain. But like, we should always feel a bit uneasy about his kind of heroism because there's no interrogation of what heroism means. It's a very narrow thing that is just he's placed in these confines and set to follow it. And then what happens again when those confines kind of break away? Who does he become then? And so I think that's really interesting.
And I think we're going to see a lot of that going forward based off of their first interaction together, because Val clearly says something to the effect of, we need people working in the shadows. Like, we need people working in this gray area. So that whole idea of heroism, I think, is going to challenge John Walker. And I agree with you. The way he reacts to the black suit, it's almost optimistic and hopeful. It's very naive. It's very naive, I think, because he's going to be put in compromising positions based off of what Val had said initially, that I think he is going to find himself struggling with once he realizes the truth of what being in this role really means. And I'm excited to kind of see where that goes, especially because, as you stated, like, throughout the entire show, he's been maybe not over the edge, but certainly teetering with it even before he fully goes over the edge. And what does that mean for him when he's forced into these positions where it's not being, good soldier, for, the American government? Like, you're going to be doing a lot of dirty work, getting your hands really messy. Like, how are you going to react to that? And maybe that will fit him well because he is kind of teetering on the edge, and that's the kind of guy they need. I don't know, but like the way they present him earlier, like in that first episode, or the first time we meet him anyway, it's like he has this immaculate military record. He always knows what to do. He always makes the decisions in the right moment, as Battlestar says at one point. That guy we haven't really seen, and going forward, I think that character will be further separated from that exposition. Because I think we're only going to see him kind of working in those messy areas. But given Wyatt Russell's performance, given where we are with that character, I think it's, there's going to be some intriguing things to come about, I think.
Yeah, one thing that I've been thinking about in terms of that character, and I think specifically, because of this week, I've seen a lot of posts about Pat Tillman, and I think that, I think that there's some interesting comparisons to be drawn in terms of, how John Walker is presented as being this former, football star who becomes this kind of poster boy for the perfect soldier. And so along the lines of talking about, of him going into this gray area, right, of having to interrogate what heroism means, what is your government actually doing? I think that's very interesting in terms of the potential to really shake his, core beliefs of, what, this secret war that he's fighting for Val is really all about. And, just wrapping his head around the fact that, the U.S. government is not this, shining beacon of perfection. But I'd be curious to know if those, parallels between John Walker and Pat Tillman were intentional, because I do think that it's really interesting that you have this soldier who became very much a poster boy for the war in Afghanistan, and the questions surrounding his death, that I think that Americans are still grappling with. I think that that's really interesting in terms of where we leave off with Walker.
Yeah, I hadn't really thought about those comparisons, but it does make a lot of sense. And that whole idea of, of Val and kind of what she represents is, it's an incredible notch, I think, to the belt of what the MCU has really always done in terms of, this moral gray area that the U.S. government has always operated in inside the MCU, even going all the way back to Iron Man and the military complex that we see in those movies, or even that in first Incredible Hulk movie, the whole idea that they were trying to replicate this serum. And as we find out in this show with the Isaiah Bradley stuff, they've been doing that for decades. And of course, treating his unit and everything that we learn about his past, this maybe not always directly, certainly in some cases, and even in Civil War, it's a little bit more direct there. But I feel like the show has always kind of tapped into that idea of, the U.S. government's up to some crap. They're up to some stuff, and we're kind of highlighting it here in some interesting ways. This is certainly another component to that. And now add in Sharon Carter, who is going to be another big component to that, right? And I don't know how to feel about the reveal of her in this final episode. And maybe it's because I was hoping that the reveal would be, I don't know. It just felt like for it to be her was a little too easy, maybe.
Yeah.
I need to see how it plays out for her, I guess, because I don't know. There's something about it, given what we have seen from her in the past, and and now it's interesting that Civil War is her origin story, her villain origin story. And I know we just haven't seen her as much in the last 4 to 5 years, so I'm not sure what to make of it.
Yeah,
I'm curious what you think.
That's my main issue, is that I feel like she wasn't prominent enough in Civil War for me to have a sense of who she was to buy the turn. I'm very curious about the direction, because I kept waiting for it to be like, oh, she's actually like, a double agent or a triple agent or something, and someone else is a power broker. And then, I kind of thought, well, maybe she's a Skrull in this post-credit scene. She's going to Green, the room Sharon is somewhere else, which is still I guess a possibility.
Yeah, I was going to say that's always there now.
Well, yeah, I'm not entirely, 100% convinced, because her actions in Civil War, she knew what she was doing, when she did that. And, I think because we don't see her in the Infinity War Endgame, so we don't have any context.
I have no clue.
What's
happening. She's not in this show enough for us to really learn what's happened to her in the last 5 years, other than she feels betrayed in some sort of way. But like you said, she knew what the consequences were going to be with her decisions in Civil War, and she still made those decisions anyway.
Yeah. So for me, Sharon is probably my biggest criticism of the series, and I love the actors. I think that Emily Van Camp is fantastic in the role, and I love that she gets to play around more with the character. But I just wish that there was more context for where we see her go. And I might have to rewatch some bits, because I'm also not entirely sure if her manipulation of Sam and Bucky tracks, and her leading them to Nagel.
Well, that was going to be my next question. Yeah. In hindsight now, that whole series of events makes no sense. Why would she lead them to a place where it would put him in danger?
Yeah.
I don't.
Yeah.
I don't know. I don't know either. And again, if going back to Zemo, like if she didn't know like the dangers of putting him in that room with that guy, she clearly didn't understand the events of Civil War. And maybe the show completely misinterprets it as well. Because in hindsight, for her to do that is among the dumbest things she could have done. And for her to get to rise the ranks and become who she is as the power broker, you would think that she doesn't get there by making those kinds of illogical decisions.
Right.
Right?
Yeah. I feel like there has to be something else going on.
Yeah. There's something we don't know.
Yeah, because it just like it doesn't track for me. And so I still like just don't believe that this is the real Sharon. And I also, I feel like there are some theories that the person on the phone she was talking to was Val, but I'm like, okay, but if it's Val, she's already in the show. They would just show that it's Val. So I feel like it's someone else.
Yeah.
I don't really think that her aim at the end and her joining the CIA and having access to government secrets really fits in with Val, who already seems to have, her ways in.
Yeah. Those seem like two different things.
For now, I'm gonna go in with the Skrull theory. And just predict that maybe there'll be some resolution in Secret Invasion, and we'll find that the real Sharon Carter has been like in a cryogenic like tube on a spaceship.
I'm gonna go with that theory as well because it just makes no sense. It's a little disheartening for one because from what we saw in Civil War, the little bits of her in the past MCU stuff, like we've always liked that character. Yeah, she's always been a fun, intriguing component. And then now to have this turn, given that we have very little context to buy that contrivance, it just doesn't make sense. And then to add in this whole power broker reveal just makes it all the more baffling to me, especially putting Zemo in the room with Nego. Like that just, and I don't buy any sort of conclusion that, oh, well, how was she supposed to know that he would do that? Well, did you not? You were there for Civil War. I mean, who this guy was.
And the guys that were chasing them in the lot with the shipping containers were the power brokers guys. So
yeah,
I mean, unless
so they're trying to kill her, even though they know that.
Right. Yeah. So I definitely feel like there's something there that I have to believe that we're supposed to like have red flags up about this.
Because you would have think like as they're fighting her, they'd be like, "Hey, you're my boss. Why are you fighting me?"
Even if her identity was secret, like I feel like she would have found a way to like get out of that without like killing her entire crew.
Yeah, I don't get that either. And yeah, it just makes no sense. And then she says as she goes to the car, she's like, "Oh, we have a problem now." Like, what does that mean?
Yeah.
Like, what do you mean we have a problem now? Like, was she talking about Sam and Bucky? Was she talking about, oh, I made a stupid decision by taking Zemo to see this guy? Like, I don't, that, like in context, that whole line is also baffling to me.
Yeah, I think we need like
well, let's just go with the Skrull theory because that's the only thing that makes sense here.
Yeah, I'm gonna stick with that for now.
that's good. I'm with it. So it's funny because I came into this conversation really the Zemo thing was my big thing. You somewhat turned me a little bit, or at least emphasized that yes, from a plotting standpoint, I still think it's kind of ridiculous, but the individual moments, like the emotional beats he has with Sam and Bucky, I can very much concede to that argument because those moments are great. I very much do like that. But I honestly, it was funny because like I came into this barely thinking about that reveal. And now that we're talking about it here, it is like, maybe that really is the biggest issue with this show right now.
Yeah.
I do have like some minor things here and there. Like, I don't think the storytelling is always even. Like there was like that first episode was really great, and I feel like episodes 2 and 3, like the kind of the emotion that was driving that first episode kind of dissipates for all this plotting and exposition. We're going to Madripoor and Zemo somehow involved for no reason. And so like I think some of that gets lost. Like Sam especially gets lost for like 2 episodes. Now he comes back huge in these last 2 episodes, don't get me wrong. And in the grand scheme of things, it's, you know, it's not completely distracting, but I do think the storytelling is a little bit uneven. Really beside that though, and I believe you tweeted this out earlier, that the strengths of the run way outweighs the flaws of it. Even the issues I have with Zemo. I kind of felt that same way after watching the final episode earlier today. I was like, man, these last 2 episodes I thought really stuck the landing. I didn't like the Zemo stuff, but overall I thought the show was quite great. You know, especially with how it handled, the themes that you were talking about relating to Sam and Isaiah, the emotion of it, everything we get with Bucky there. I mean, there's so much more going on to the show that I think the strengths of it way outweigh any issues I had with it.
Yeah, same. You know, I feel like I have never seen a superhero show of this type, you know, of Marvel or DC outside of Watchmen, you know, tackle race in such a significant way. And, you know, I talked about this a little bit in my piece, but I think that, you know, Black Panther is very different. You know, it does address certain issues, but I mean, it's an isolated African community, which is different from, you know, a Black, experience in America.
Yeah.
And so I think, you know, to have a show that actually like says like, hey, like this country was built on like the backs of Black people, like in a show that like is appealing to like all age groups and like mass, like even if it's stuff that like a lot of like, you know, audiences who are, you know, into to film and to politics and art. I mean, like it's stuff that film Twitter is very much aware of course. Yeah. But like outside of that, if you're talking about like a general audience, I mean, I really do think that these are some revolutionary like concepts in terms of superhero adaptations. You know, and I don't use that word lightly at all, because I do think that what we see here is really important. You know, sure, we can talk about, you know, the Tuskegee experiments and systemic racism and stuff, you know, as people who, you know, have seen a lot of movies, are tuned into media and, you know, what's going on, you know, everywhere. But I think like for, you know, the people that are watching it who are not like in that space, who are not always connected to social media, you know, and seeing people bring up these issues and concerns, like I think that this is really powerful stuff that I think asks the viewer to, you know, look a little deeper, like explore some of their biases, but also like to look at American history. And one of the things that I keep going back to in my pieces was, you know, we can't like deal with our present issues, you know, the social and systemic issues that are happening in America right now. We can't do that without reckoning with our past. You know, and really looking at the awful history of the American government. And I think that the show like asks the viewer to like actually reflect on that.
Yeah,
and I think that that's really important, you know. And I mean, it's not going to cover everything. I mean, I think it's impossible to expect one series or one character to, you know, dive the depths of the entire like sinful American experience. But I think that, you know, the steps that it makes, like it moves the needle, I think, significantly in terms of what we have seen before in these like major, you know, superhero adaptations. I think that this is a really significant piece of superhero storytelling.
I completely agree, and I think that's why not just those ideas that you're talking about, but the performances as well. I mean,
Yeah.
we briefly mentioned Carl Lumbly earlier. Like, he is so good. Every time he's on screen is breathtaking.
I hope he gets an Emmy nomination.
I completely agree. Agree. And Anthony Mackie's really great as well. While, yeah, of course, you can't cover the entire depths of America's history with racism. When the show does tackle it, though, it's done with such grace and nuance. There's great texture to the conversations. As we talked about earlier, there's an interesting dichotomy between Isaiah and Sam that they don't, always see. They don't see the symbol of the shield the same because of their experiences. Yet neither of them are wrong.
Right.
They have a great conversation about it, but with respect and honor toward each other regarding where they come from and what they think is best for the future, especially as it relates to that symbol. And it's really great. And I also think there's another moment that I don't think we've referenced yet that I love as it relates to Bucky, but also Steve, where Bucky says to Sam, when we decided to give you that, we had no clue what it meant for us as white people to give this symbol to a Black American.
Yeah.
Like that to me is incredible. Like, that's that kind of get out moment in this movie.
Yeah.
Or in this series, I mean, where, it's the things that we as white people, we don't always think about these things because our experiences are obviously very different. And sometimes the things we say, the things we do, it might be affable, but there are these underlying things like consequences that we didn't know about.
Yeah.
And obviously that's all Get Out does it in a very different way, obviously.
Right.
But I love that moment in the show and kind of what it means for Sam as he begins to kind of take up the mantle with the shield, and how it kind of ties back to all those things that you were just talking about. It's incredible. And for 6 episodes, I still feel like it never really loses sight of that. Maybe in episode 2 with all the stuff from Madripoor, but for the most part, man, the show just freaking nails it as far as I'm concerned. I thought it was all great. And tying it into Bucky. It's not like, even as the show is doing those things, it's not like Bucky is lost in the conversation either.
Right.
Like, it's all tethered together wonderfully.
Yeah, and I think that, not only in terms of race, which was the main thing that I was kind of thinking about during the season, but also just seeing like some of the opinions of veterans, and I think the show is also very much about how America treats its military veterans. And I think that comes through in Bucky's storyline, and it comes through in John Walker's storyline, and Sam's as well.
And Lamar
in different ways, and Lamar. And so I think that is also really important, and just some brilliant writing. I think that the MCU gets some flack, I think, for being pro-military. But I think that, overall, I think that the show actually does a lot to kind of interrogate certain ideas that we have about, the responsibility of the government. I don't really think that it lets it off the hook, or, it's serving as a form of propaganda.
I mean, even the first Iron Man did that, right? Like the first Iron Man movie, Tony Stark eventually has the epiphany of like, maybe we shouldn't be doing this. Maybe we shouldn't be selling our weapons to other groups.
Yeah, and these are all complicated issues, and I appreciate that the show allows them to be complicated. And to be complicated doesn't mean that we always have to feel entirely satisfied with the choices that characters make, or entirely understand where they're coming from. I think that it's fine to just allow things to be complicated. And that, going back to Sam and Isaiah's conversation, the thing that I love so much about it, as we've said, is that, neither Sam or Isaiah are wrong. And we just can find, solace in the fact that these are complicated matters that have no right or wrong answers. And it's fine to just allow them to be complicated.
Absolutely. I completely agree. Sometimes it's just intrinsic to history and to human emotion. Because people are complicated. There's so much nuances. We're not always defined by one thing, and which is a whole big thing of what this series is about, whether it be John or Sam, Bucky, whoever the case may be. Like, we're not defined by the one thing in our past. And I think what's interesting with Isaiah is that he's tried to run from the thing that's defined him in the past. Like, he's afraid for that truth to come to light until he sees that maybe hope is possible with Sam as Captain America, which is what gives so much weight to that final moment.
Yeah.
Because without that, like without the film building to that in such a specific way, there's no way Isaiah reacts to that the way that he does at the end. He would be more upset than anything. But it built to it. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, that's what I wrote about in my piece today, is that, it's not the fact that there's an exhibit in a Smithsonian museum that's like operated by the government. Like, that's not what like makes him emotional. It's Sam that makes him emotional.
Yes.
It's Sam being able to create change in a way that he did not think was possible before. Yeah,
100%. Yeah, and the show handles that perfectly as far as I'm concerned. Oh, absolutely love it. There was one other thing that I wanted to talk about here real fast before we get out of here. And that is one Henry Jackman. My God, his music for the show is so good. I love his scores for the Captain America movies. That Captain America Winter Soldier review or score, is so underrated. It is honestly one of the very best scores in the MCU. Nobody talks about it. Oh, it is great. Yeah. And I love that he incorporates all the themes from that, as well as the stuff from Civil War as well. It's so handled wonderfully. He doesn't do a ton of stuff. He doesn't get a bunch of recognition like some of the other Marvel composers, but I had to highlight him because I absolutely adored the music to this series as well.
Yeah. Sam's New Orleans theme is fantastic.
Oh, yeah. Oh, gosh. Yeah, absolutely love it. Okay, well, that will kind of wrap up this conversation on the Falcon and the Winter Soldier. Before we get out of here, though, there's one other thing I want to ask you about. Before we do that, though, let's kind of tie a bow on Falcon and the Winter Soldier. Do you have any final thoughts on the show? Anything else that we missed that you wanted to highlight here real quick?
I love what the show did. Captain America has long been one of my favorite Marvel characters, one of my favorite MCU characters. And I love just the depths that this series explored. I never imagined some of the levels that we would get to in the show. And, just kind of what I tweeted earlier is that, yes, like there are some flaws and there are some issues, but like overall, like what it accomplishes and the emotional beats and where we leave Sam and Bucky in the end, like far outweigh any complaints for me. And I'm very much excited to see where their journey takes them next.
Yeah, I'm very excited for that as well. That is a great final thought, right? Because I assume we're going to get a fourth Captain America movie with obviously Sam now as Captain America, Bucky being intertwined in there in some way. So I'm very curious as to what that's going to look like going forward. I imagine Val will be involved. I imagine Sharon Carter will be involved in some way going forward. They've certainly planted those seeds. Whatever that next Captain America movie is going to look like, I imagine Sam will be one of the leaders, if not the leader of the Avengers now going forward as well.
Yeah.
Because obviously, like, he's now taken up this mantle, but we haven't seen the reaction from the other Avengers yet. So I'm curious for that.
I'm really excited for that. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. So, I'm very curious to see kind of where things go. Speaking of the future of the MCU, real quick, I wanted to get your thoughts on this as well, because we got a trailer for Shang-Chi, and I'm curious what you thought about that.
I am very hyped. I can't wait.
Yeah.
I think that, I think it has the potential to be akin to Black Panther for Asian American audiences.
Yeah.
And I think that, it really is going to add some cool stuff to the MCU. It's a completely unexplored territory. Not only just like the Kung Fu stuff, but we're getting some really cool, like historical stuff, it looks like. We're finally getting the real Mandarin.
Yeah, I'm excited for that.
I think that that's going to be really interesting. And I think that, the way it's going to dispel certain stereotypes about the character, I'm really interested in seeing. I think it's going to be a really powerful movie. I think it's a character that I think most audiences are not familiar with. But I definitely think that, he's going to be a major player going forward.
Yeah, I agree as well. I kind of gave some brief thoughts on our latest episode for anyone listening that may have heard that, but I'm certainly one of those. I'm not as familiar with the character, so this will be a learning process for me. But I'm so excited. That trailer for me, maybe this is hyperbole, maybe it's just the hype because it's so fresh, but I thought it was honestly one of the best Marvel trailers I've seen. It was so good. I absolutely loved it. And maybe part of it is that freshness, because to put it in context or in perspective, the way I talked about it on the show this last week is, you compare it to something like The Force Awakens, for example. Star Wars, we're familiar with those characters. Some of them are coming back. We haven't had a Star Wars movie in forever. Like when that trailer dropped and the Hope theme plays, like it was so easy to get giddy and excited. And I love the trailers for The Force Awakens because of that. This is the complete other side of that coin, right? Where I know nothing about this character or the lore surrounding it.
Yeah.
All I know is that Marvel has somewhat been teasing, the Legend of the Ten Rings or the organization for some time now. When we had the fake Mandarin, that was it. Yeah. That's all that I am really aware of. But my reaction to this trailer was basically the same. I was so out of my mind. So that's just indicative of how great I thought the trailer was and how exciting this material looks. And also Tony Leung as the Mandarin, I mean, that blows my mind. Like, I know he's done some action stuff before. Like, he was really great in Hero. I love that movie. And most of his other martial arts stuff, I'm just sadly a blind spot. What I really know him from is the Wong Kar-wai movies, which is so not Marvel. So for him to be in this, like, that's incredible. And of course, you got Michelle Yeoh in there. Aquafina should be a lot of fun. I'm really, really pumped for this, even though I don't know anything about it. Got a lot of research and homework to do leading up to the movie, but man, it looks good. It looks so good.
This phase, I'm loving what they're doing with phase 4. It just feels like so creatively energized. They're getting a lot of different voices. I mean, and then the fact that like Shang-Chi looks awesome, but then like a couple months from that, you're gonna get Chloe Zhao's
and there's only one reason we haven't seen a trailer for that.
Right? Oh yeah. They're waiting for that best director one. Yeah.
Exactly. For a best director, Chloe Zhao. Exactly. They're waiting on that.
Yeah.
And I'm excited. I can't wait to see her win that Oscar. She's totally going to win. And then I bet you next week we'll get the trailer for Eternals. I guarantee it.
Yeah. These are good times.
Yeah, I know, right? I can't believe it. It's crazy to me. Marvel's Oscar-winning director behind one of their biggest next movies. So I'm with you. This next phase looks like it's going to be a ton of fun. I'm certainly here for it. So thanks again for joining me, man. This was a lot of fun as always. One more time, go ahead, plug your stuff. Where can we find you on social media?
Yeah, I am on Twitter at Richard L. Newby, and I cover comic books and science fiction, fantasy for the Hollywood Reporter. I'm doing some comic book stuff for Inverse, and then I'm covering horror for Fangoria.
Yeah, definitely go and check out his stuff. I cannot recommend it enough. It is really, really great. And give Richard a follow on Twitter there as well. Yeah, this was a lot of fun. For those
Yeah.
that are just listening to the podcast version of this, we stream this live on YouTube. So if you want to see more of these in the future, hit us up at youtube.com/InSessionFilm. And of course, follow us on social media. We'll make sure we have information out there for all of this stuff. And for those that did tune in to the video, either live or after the fact, thanks for tuning in as well. Yeah, this was great. I am off to now go watch Mortal Kombat.
Same.
I have no idea what's about to happen, but it should be fun. So,
yeah.
all right. Yeah. All right. Thanks, Richard. Thanks for listening, everybody. We will see you all next time on the In Session Film Podcast.